Welcome to the sixth lecture from chapter number 4. We are studying VLSI design, and in this chapter we are studying fabrication of CMOS ICs. Right. In this lecture we'll study the process in which a CMOS IC is built. The main steps. There are a few main steps that we will discuss here. First of all, we know that the base material is a lightly doped P substrate material, the P-type material. On top of it, before we implement anything, we implement a P plus epitaxial layer. What is this P plus means? P plus means it's a relatively heavily doped p-type material. Although the underlying material P substrate is also p-type, but this P plus type material is heavily doped, having more number of impurity ions per cubic per cubic micrometer of this substrate of the silicon wafer. Right. After we have converted this top thin layer into a heavily doped p-type material, we first implement an well. We already know from what we studied before it that why do we implement an well, right? If we are using P substrate material, we cannot implement PMOS directly, right? To implement PMOS transistor. So if you want to implement a PMOS transistor, we cannot implement P plus type drain and source directly on a P type substrate. That won't work. So that is why we need this N well material. So N well is implemented. It's kind of a well that is implemented within the P substrate, and well is implemented everywhere we want to implement a PMOS, right? So everywhere we want to implement a PMOS, we will first implement an N well there. We have already studied that, right? Step number 3 is we'll define active areas. Active areas are doped silicon regions, N plus and P plus, corresponding to drain and source. So N plus and P plus type areas which correspond to drain and source. N plus drain and source are there in NMOS, and P plus drain and source are there for PMOS. That is also something we already know that. Right, so we'll first use the lithographic process to obtain hardened layers on top of the places where we want to implement active areas. Active areas means N plus or P plus areas corresponding to drain or source. In fact, drain and source. So, and we have these something in between this portion and this portion. Why do we leave these portions softened? Because we want to separate. We will implement the one transistor here under this green shaded area, another transistor under this green shaded area, and another transistor here. So we want to separate them electrically. That is why we'll implement an oxide layer in between any two transistors. If they are not electrically connected, we have to separate them. So we'll need a kind of insulator in between. So we'll finally implement an insulator here and an insulator here to electrically insulate side by side implemented transistors. Right, that is why we have left this as a gap. Right, And then fourth step is we will etch this silicon region, that is the gap between side by side implemented transistors. We'll etch it and then we'll fill this with silicon dioxide. And the silicon dioxide that we fill in between these transistors, we call it FOX. FOX means field oxide. FOX. So we have two FOX materials here. In this given sample, we have two FOX materials, field oxide. A field oxide here, a field oxide here. A field oxide here will separate this transistor from this transistor electrically, and this field oxide will separate this transistor and this transistor. Right, so under these green shaded areas now we are ready to implement doped silicon regions, and then we'll use a chemical to remove these green hardened layers, so that now we can etch these layers and convert them into doped silicon regions. So in this step we have prepared the surface by removing those hardened layers, by removing that hardened layer, and then we'll first fix poly first, right? So this is also called, we have fixed polys first, the gates first. This is we call self-aligned. Another name to this process is self-aligned gate process. Self-aligned gate process. We'll align gate first before we have implemented doped silicon regions. And then in step number 8, we will suppress the areas, these areas that we have to convert into N plus regions, the areas corresponding to NMOS, where we want to implement NMOS transistors, and we'll expose the areas where we are supposed to convert them into P plus regions. So, and we will ion implant boron impurity, and we know that boron impurity is a trivalent impurity. So it will convert this portion that is exposed to it into P plus, that is P type region, right? And we'll suppress this, although this bombardment will also be on this area, but we have covered this with a resist, and these boron ions cannot pass through this resist and therefore will not dope these areas, the areas corresponding to NMOS. And then finally in step number 9, and the last step, we will cover in the same resist, we will cover the areas corresponding to PMOS transistors, and we'll reveal the areas corresponding to NMOS, where we want to implement NMOS transistors. And then we will have implantation of arsenic, and we know that arsenic implantation, arsenic is a pentavalent impurity. Arsenic or antimony, they are pentavalent impurities having 5 electrons in their outermost shell. We'll convert them into N plus regions, and this fog separates neighboring transistors electrically. Right, we will, in our next lecture, we will continue studying more about CMOS process flow, and we'll also discuss some specialized techniques. Right, that's all for this lecture. Thank you.